My name is Justin Achilli. I'm giving a presentation today here at ECGC on, sorry, I'll talk slower, building a transmedia brand from interactive experiences. I am the creative director for the World of Darkness brand at Paradox Interactive. Paradox is centered in Stockholm in Sweden. I was in Sweden for a year. I came back, we were just talking about this, because I couldn't get my kids into Sweden during a pandemic. So I'm doing it remotely from here, which is actually kind of cool because I get to work with partners who are all over the world. Being in the US and the East Coast in particular is kind of convenient time zone wise. So what you're going to see me talking about here is fun because I'm talking to people on the West Coast of the United States, and I'm talking to people in Poland, and I'm talking to people in Stockholm still. So it really is an opportunity like no other time in history to work worldwide. So if you have an opportunity to pursue a career further in video games, oh man, take it. You get free trips all over the place. So without further ado, we'll get going. We're going to start with some definitions here. I know transmedia is kind of a loaded word. I promise not to use the word metaverse unless one of y'all ask me about it. Gotcha. Yes, definitions. First off, a little more about me. I have an extensive career in tabletop games, in video games, and in VR in terms of some emergent technology there. Most of my experience is in the World of Darkness. I've been working on it for about 25 years. But I've also worked in the Assassin's Creed brand. I've worked on the Star Trek property. I was the game director on the Werewolves Within game, which got turned from a VR game into a movie that had nothing to do with the VR game except some of the ideas there. So you can kind of see how some ideas of transmedia kind of propagate. And also during a very, very dark time in my life, I worked on a Facebook game based on House MD. The less about which said the better. Giving a definition on what transmedia itself is, we'll start here with a definition by Henry Jenkins. He's one of the prominent thinkers about the topic. Transmedia storytelling represents a process where integral elements of a fiction get dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. Okay? Ideally, each medium makes its own unique contribution to the unfolding of the story. Very scholarly there, very well thought out, very, let's say, wordy. Let's use a quick and dirty definition of it. Transmedia is telling multiple stories across multiple media in a shared universe. So one example that I like to give here is, you can think about the Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings started out as a series of books, and then got turned into a couple of board games, a couple of role-playing games, where you're telling the stories of the books. Then got turned into some movies that were telling the stories of the books. So even though you're working in multiple media there, they weren't telling different stories in most cases. They were retelling the same story. Now, of course, that's very, very different. The Lord of the Rings IP goes across multiple different games, telling different stories. The prequels, etc., have been adapted from certain media into certain other media. So now, the Lord of the Rings is approaching a true transmedia brand because it's telling those different stories in different media, obviously in the same shared universe there. If you want to get official, I think 3 stories across 3 media is what it officially means, but I don't know how important that is. The idea here is that we're really thinking about that one shared universe that gives us different opportunities to have different experiences in different kinds of ways. Sounds like a bunch of bullshit. I promise it becomes more substantial. Part 2 here, let's start talking specifically about World of Darkness, since that's where most of my work is. World of Darkness is a contemporary horror brand. The way we like to think of it is it's based on secrets and consequences. The premise is that you are the monster. You are a vampire, you are a werewolf, you are some kind of monstrous thing, and all of this exists in secret. You know, some of us here in the room right now are vampires, and well, not vampires because it's on the outside, but there are monsters here among us. And the monsters every day have to make these decisions that they're going to pay costs for. You know, as a vampire, you're going to have to feed on innocent people, drink their blood, and this corrodes your humanity. This turns you more and more down that road of monstrousness, turns you into the beast. So you can choose when to feed, you can choose how to feed, you can choose who to feed on. All of these decisions ultimately will turn you into that monster, and that's where the interesting stories come from. What cost will you pay to remain? And getting into some of like the business details of this, I'm not going to read these to you, but we've been translated into a lot of languages. The first game was published in 1991. It is one of the true Transmedia brands because we've told stories across novels, across comic books, board games, we've had video games, we've had a fantastic television show called Kindred the Embraced, which I'm sure you all remember. We've had a variety of different kind of computer games in different genres as well. You might know Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. You might remember a little bit about the World of Darkness MMO. RIP, didn't happen. But all of these things, we have told different stories in different genres and are continuing to do so as the bulk of the value of the brand. Also, we really got into Kickstarter early on, or crowdfunding early on. The brand itself had kind of run its course by the time CCP had acquired it. It was no longer being published in traditional TTRPG format. We did a 20th anniversary edition of the game, and distributors told us, oh, we can't sell that, we can only sell 2,000 copies of it. So instead of going through that traditional publication method, we kind of did it ourselves from the ground up and sold directly to the customers. Back when Kickstarter was back in its early, I don't want to say throes, but coming into being. So we used crowdfunding early on as well. There was a feature-length documentary about the World of Darkness in 2018. I think it's still on Prime, if you have Prime Video there. But if you feel like checking out more, they tell a bit of the story there. And so looking at it in terms of what are the vital topics, or what are the vital titles now, Bloodlines 2 is still in development, if you've been following that. You can see Vampire the Masquerade, which is kind of the flagship property. It's the one about playing a vampire, and that's the TTRPG. We've also got the Rivals card game, Vampire the Eternal Struggle kind of deck building game, Wraith the Oblivion Afterlife, which is a VR experience, Vampire the Masquerade Blood Hunt, which is a battle royale done by Shark Mob, which is part of the team that did the Tom Clancy's Division, if you were here for Richard Dansky's presentation prior to me. There's a visual novel in the form of Coteries of New York and Shadows of New York. Vampire the Masquerade Winter's Teeth is a comic book. So obviously you see here we've got a bunch of different stories being told in a bunch of different formats to kind of reinforce the true transmedia experience. We've got the creative partnership in Hollywood with the crew that has worked on The Witcher. So big hopes for that. Probably better than Vampire or Kindred the Embraced. So we'll see where that goes. But future's looking bright for it, and so I'm trying to help guide it that way. Great, that's me. Why do you want to do transmedia for your IP or for the company that you're working with? Great question. The first of which is that audiences themselves are insatiable, and I'm sure all of you have experienced this. If you've worked on any game at all, you've never won the content war. If you have played an MMO and you've waited for an expansion to come out and it's taken the company 9, 10, 12, 16 months to make that expansion, and you eat up all of those quests in the first 14 hours it's been released, right? We just can't, as content producers, keep on top of that in a single format. So what you want to do here is build a transmedia strategy that allows you to have multiples of these experiences kind of in the hopper, developing at the same time. So while your MMO is being built, here's a novel that you can read, and here's a comic book. When you have consumed that novel, you can read that, and this is all pointing up into the experience that the MMO builds. Oh, and while you're playing the MMO, you might also enjoy this action game. And you don't even need to be confined traditionally by genre. If you've got the IP for it and it fits into match 3s or dating sims, that's fine. But the idea here is that you want to have multiple stories being developed in parallel so they can come out at different times, because your audience is going to consume them faster than you can release them. And why is this important? Well, while you're waiting on that next piece of content to drop for the MMO or for whatever, season 2 of the show, well, you might enjoy this companion game while you are while that's in production. And the important part here being that if your audience doesn't have a journey to take with your IP, if the audience doesn't have a kind of thread they can follow with your brand, they're going to go to something else, right? They're going to go to one of the 15 superhero movies that released this year. They're going to go to one of the other pieces of fiction that gives them what your brand gives them, and then from that fiction move into the game. They're gonna move into someone else's brand experience, someone else's transmedia. One of the other reasons you want to do transmedia is to match the story that you're trying to tell to a specific format. And here, I was kind of kidding around just a moment ago about the dating sim, but if you have an IP that involves romance, a lot of the vampire experience is about, that kind of secretly yearning and finally consummating that relationship. It's kind of a dating sim, so maybe a dating sim wouldn't even be or wouldn't be unthinkable for vampire. But it really depends on kind of how you're thinking about the stories that you want to tell. What is the best way to tell those? So find the best fit for whatever your story is. If you were here for the previous conversation, there was a little bit of a question at the end about ludonarrative dissonance at the end. That's true for a transmedia brand as well, but even beyond the games, even going into the traditional media, you want to tell the story that is best for, if you've got an action show, maybe the romance isn't the place for the action show. And so I'm kind of setting up here what we're going to get to in a couple moments, but your brand isn't necessarily just a point on a spectrum. Your brand is kind of a band within that spectrum. And so vampire might be a very high violence, very spiky, punctuated by not even combat, like, a violence and assault. The vampire comes out of the darkness and, consumes their victim. I was talking about the Battle Royale game a moment ago. Might not seem like a logical, first thought, oh, vampires, of course, Battle Royale. But the story of Blood Hunt, this is the one night all hell breaks loose in Prague. And as a Battle Royale, you're playing that night over and over and over. Each match is what happened that night. By contrast, we could also go to Coteries of New York, which is one of the other titles in the brand there. And it's telling the story of, here's a new vampire first finding out what being a vampire means. Oh my gosh, there's this society of vampires, and I need to navigate it very, very carefully. Again, you've got a spectrum here, or you've got a band in the spectrum. Your brand doesn't have to be one specific thing. What it also allows you to do is maintain an authenticity and a consistency because your audience really, really wants this. If, for example, you're playing vampires and you can't go outside in the sunlight, but you've got a TV show, say Kindred the Embraced, and all of a sudden vampires are running around in kind of the duskish. Okay, well, these are vampires, why are they not burning up in the sunlight when the book says they do, or when the other games say they do? Kindred the Embraced was not received very well back in the 90s by our audiences. It was almost universally panned. It was produced by Aaron Spelling. Aaron Spelling, of course, was wanting to build the Aaron Spelling brand, which was more about romance, which was more about kind of a nighttime soap opera sort of thing. And so this was not a good transmedia fit here, even though we were telling different stories in formats that we hadn't before. There was no authenticity, there was no consistency. They used a few of the words that vampire enthusiasts were familiar with, but the experience of vampires running around in the daylight really broke the fantasy for some people. And yes, your brand is a slider. It's a band in that spectrum. Find how wide it is. The wider it is, the better you will do. But overall, don't fixate on just one thing. Give yourself enough room to tell this variety of stories. Otherwise, you're really doing yourself a disservice. It'll be harder to do your job, and you're also restricting your audience. So finding that audience, discovery. Has anybody played games on Steam ever? Right? Yeah, how many games came out on Steam last year? About 12,000. 30 games came out every day last year. How does anyone find your game? I don't know, that's a marketing problem. But where this starts to help you is as you build multiple titles. Let's say you start here, you've got an HD game. Your audience comes to the HD game, but also you've been planning a mobile game as well and a card game, so you know that these are going to be in production eventually. So each one of these games, each one of these transmedia experiences is a point of ingress into your brand. So let's say, however lucky we are, we discovered you found the game, and the HD game would be an introduction to the mobile game, would be an introduction to the card game. But let's say you don't play Steam, right? You're a traditional, or you're very on the go, you have a very on the go lifestyle, you're more interested in mobile games. Okay, well, you start playing the mobile game, you discover it however you do, and this also potentially pulls you into the HD game, into the card game, or you're a brick and mortar player that likes to play at your hobby shop, you play Friday Night Magic, and while you're there in the store, you see they've got Rivals as well, so you get into Vampire the Rivals, and you get into the mobile game, and you get into the HD game, and obviously, the more titles you have, the greater this matrix becomes. It becomes a force multiplier. It's not, of course, just as easy as, make 1 million games, because each of them has a production budget, obviously. But the more you're able to offer your audience points of ingress, the more they're going to come to your brand, stay with the brand, and migrate between the titles within it. This is important for revenue, of course. If we start thinking about this access here, if one of these lines is the amount of money that can be spent in your brand, and the other line, the vertical line, is how much money the player has to spend. Let's say you've got one title, and your HD game is $60, maybe $70, and you capture the people who are interested in your brand and want to spend $70 in it. By contrast, if your brand is built so that there are any number of experiences in it, and maybe you can spend $1 million in your brand, there are players who will find that. There are players who will spend $1 million in your brand. And I'm not saying this to be crass, right? I'm not saying soak your audience for all they're worth. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying these are all stories that you can tell and presumably want to tell because you love your brand. And the more opportunities you give players to do stuff in your world, the more they're going to love it, right? If you're a Marvel enthusiast, you've probably read the comic books and played the games and watched the movies and bought the shirts. And the more room there is for you to spend money, the more room there is for you to enjoy it. Again, not being crass, think about it even in terms of outside of traditional fandom. Golf players. I'm not a golfer myself, but I've got a friend who golfs. He loves buying shoes and clubs and balls. And I don't want to buy any of this stuff, but who wants to pay green fees? He loves it though, right? The more he can spend in his hobby, the more he gets to spend time in that hobby. And so, looking here at the shapes, which of the surface areas would you rather capture in terms of dollars, right? Probably the orange one. Does anybody not want more money? Okay, just checking. So why then do you want to build your Transmedia franchise to be interactive? That's one of the things that I always like to push about thinking games first is games are different from traditional media because they're interactive. In a book that I write, I tell you the story. In a movie that I make, I tell you the story. In an album that I record, I sing the songs to you. In a comic book, I tell you the story and I show you the art. In a game, though, remember, again, if you were here for the previous talk, do you remember Richard Dansky's player-shaped whole? The player is living the experience. The player is making the decision. The player is taking the choices that make that story their own, that make it uniquely theirs. And so this is why you want to build your Transmedia brand to be interactive, because there's a sense of ownership, we'll see, that comes when the player does the thing themselves. The first of which here is Spreadable Media. If you've ever played, y'all know what Twitch is, right? People watch other people play games. People streaming formats, people capture videos and share them on YouTube. If it doesn't spread, it's dead, right? This is kind of an evolution of thinking. Previously, if you remember portals, people would go to a website and this portal would be their destination, and you get you learn everything about the show you're watching from this portal. Well, that's not true any longer. In fact, having just one single destination be where you go for that information doesn't work anymore. People share media with one another. This is different from stickiness. Stickiness is you going into that portal. I go to the portal every day to check in. By contrast, these streams, these videos, these activities, ARGs, live action role-playing games, all of these can themselves be recorded, and they can be passed to other people, and the activity themselves that's occurring in this thing that's being recorded is itself an experience. So when I play the Battle Royale game and record it, that's different from your experience in the Battle Royale game. I'm terrible at Battle Royales. I get shot in the head all the time. You have much better reaction time than I do. Your streaming video is much better than mine. But these are different stories that are told. And now I send a friend a video, you send a friend a video. Here's two different stories being sent in the same format that we each own independently. And now we've evangelized these other players into coming and checking these out with us. And then sharing itself is part of the engagement here. Not only have I recorded this video of me getting shot in the head, I've set it to a song that I like, and now ha ha ha, it's really funny, here's me getting shot in the head a whole bunch to these very staccato parts of this song. So I'm remixing this media that has come together. The existing stories, even if you've watched maybe a stream, is anybody familiar with Critical Role, the D&D game? Taking pieces of those, making your own GIFs out of them, stitching the videos together. We have a Vampire the Masquerade game playing out on TikTok right now, where it's people just kind of responding to one another and sending those videos to the media platform there. So there's the sense that all of this is happening in a world, even though we're not printing the events of Exeter by Night. All of that's happening separately and being sent in between the players. And the important part there that I zipped away from and didn't mean to is that the players are telling their own stories. So this is also part of why you want to make your brand interactive, because when players tell their own stories, when your audience tells your own story, you, in control of the brand, you don't even need to be the storyteller necessarily. You don't have to build these experiences. You kind of build the setting, the environment, the world in which these experiences happen. And either your players or your partners then actually tell the story. The way I think of it is I'm building a terrarium, right? I'm drawing the creative constraints. I'm saying the world is like this. And then Blood Hunt happens in that world, and Bloodlines 2 will happen in that world, and LA by Night will happen in that world, and your game happening in your living room on Thursday nights every other week. That all happens in that world. And I've told none of these stories. You've told the stories, or Shark Mob has told the story, or set up that playground there. All of these emerge from the players doing it, from the interactive experience. They are building this. And for the player, the benefit here is they now own the story. When I staked the prince and drank his blood, I became prince. That's awesome. Different for you. You became the baron, and you don't even have any interest in politics, right? You just became the most powerful blood sorcerer in town, and these are all different stories, and each of us owns these differently. Good job killing the baron, by the way. And then once we start sharing these, we automatically have the commonality between us. We have this common interest, we start building a community, we share these on Discord, we share these on Twitter, we share these wherever we do, even just emailing them among one another. And so now we have this commonality, this point of interest there. And one of the things that I find interesting I spent most of my career in multiplayer games, and I've watched players will easily set aside any given game, but once they have a community, they stick with that community, and that community migrates across games. So in this case, I would like to keep the community in the brand, but I want that community to go from Blood Hunt to Bloodlines to the tabletop to a live action event happening in New Orleans where we all get together and celebrate the world of darkness. But you going with your friends there, you never quit a group of friends. It's easy to quit a game. It's easy to move out of a game. But this is stuff that's going to stick with you for your life, and you own all the stories that have happened in it. And so once we start thinking about what do we really want as human beings, if you're familiar with self-determination theory, people ultimately want three things. They want mastery, they want to see themselves get better, and they want autonomy, they want to feel that their choices matter, they want to be in control of their life, and they want relatedness. They want either the world or the people in it to show appreciation or an understanding of what they've done. So when I said, good job killing the Baron a moment ago, you feel good about that, right? You did that, you accomplished it, I've just related to you, and now we have that point of commonality. We have something that we belong to together. So this fits into motivational psychology. I steal a lot of it for game design. It's really my preferred toolbox, but it also feels very at home in why a brand appeals to people. The world itself also becomes something that the audience does rather than they observe. And I like to think of this in terms of you can even play while you're not playing. You start thinking about, oh, I'm going to have this build that does this. So instead of just, we went to the movies and we saw the movies and we left 2 hours later, instead it's, oh, what did you do? Oh, well, today I got a new ghoul. I brought this new person into control. Oh, well, I ran into the werewolves. And so the choices that we make start to build the story for us, as opposed to being controlled, and the experience we have is very limited to what the auteur, what the filmmaker wants us to experience. This makes the world a destination, and ultimately the audience belongs to the world and vice versa, and I put an asterisk there because this is where brand managers get hinky. Not actually saying that, oh, well, it's community ownership of the IP, because I would be fired because you need to own the IP and monetize it, but really you feel like without me, this world wouldn't exist. Without the stories that I'm telling, this world would be less. And as someone who is a creative director, I want you to feel like that. I want you to feel so welcome in the world and so important in the world.